a scientist at JPL. I've been a scientist there for about 11 years, and I work in the carbon cycle and ecosystems group. So the focus of my research is the study of terrestrial ecosystems using satellite images, and I specifically use sensors called microwave sensors, and I studied two types of ecosystems: wetland ecosystems and boreal ecosystems. So I study the vegetation in the northern high latitudes and how a changing climate is having an impact on these ecosystems. So today I'll be focusing on trees, the lungs of the earth. And really when I talk about trees, I'm also referring to vegetation. So I'll talk about the carbon cycle and how the contribution of trees in the carbon cycle, and then how we're observing the carbon cycle from space, and specifically the contribution of trees and vegetation. So let me start out with explaining the carbon cycle. So it's a cycle, right? So carbon is the building block of life. We are made up of carbon. Animals, plants are made up of carbon. And this carbon is stored in different reservoirs around our planet, in the ocean. And actually the ocean is the largest reservoir of carbon. It's stored on land and on trees and in the soil, and it's in rocks, and it's stored also in the atmosphere. And so the arrows that you're seeing here, the purple arrows indicate that carbon is being taken up, and the yellow arrows indicate that carbon is being released. So it's a cycle. It's always the same carbon in the planet. It's just being cycled around these different reservoirs. And on land specifically, plants remove carbon from the atmosphere through a process called photosynthesis. And I'll talk more about this in the next slide. So when animals eat plants and either breathe out the carbon, or this carbon is moved up the food chain. And also when animals and plants die and decay, that carbon is transferred into the soil. So what's happening in our planet is that we are taking these large reservoirs of stored carbon, and we're releasing that into the atmosphere through burning of fossil fuels. And we're doing this, or we've been doing this, in a very short period of time. So it's taken hundreds of thousands of millions of years for these large reservoirs to form, and we're releasing those in a very short period of time. So this is a bit of an issue, right? So usually the carbon cycle is in balance. You know, what's released into the atmosphere is kind of taken up by the ocean and what's on land, but usually it's in balance, but we have been tipping that balance by taking the stored carbon and releasing it into the atmosphere. So what is specifically the role of trees? You know, you saw that there are these reservoirs, but really what's the process of taking up that carbon and storing it? So trees are part of that process. And as I mentioned, through photosynthesis, what they do is they use the sun's energy and they convert carbon dioxide into oxygen and carbohydrates, starch. And then that starch is used for the plant growth, and part of it is stored in the plant itself, and that's known as biomass. So it's carbon mass, and that's stored in the trunk, it's stored in the leaves, in the stems, and the branches. So it's a very fundamental process for life on Earth, photosynthesis, taking the sun's energy, carbon dioxide, and together with water to produce oxygen and starches. And then this carbon is not only stored in the plant itself, in the roots as well, But part of it is in the soil. Also, as a tree loses its leaves, those leaves, their carbon mass, they decompose and they're part of the soil. So very important process and very critical to life on Earth. And that's why we tend to call, or it's a great metaphor to talk about trees and vegetation in general as the lungs of the planet. They're taking up CO2 from the atmosphere and they're converting that to, they're storing it in their structure and they're producing oxygen, very important. Also, the one thing about trees is that as they grow, they're taking up more CO2 from the atmosphere than when they're mature. So it kind of tapers off that uptake of CO2 throughout the life of a tree. And this is an animation. Let me just play this. Kind of this carbon cycle or this life of a tree on land. Okay, so it takes up CO2. You've got the trees. This is in spring. It'll grow out the leaves. And those leaves will fall in the fall. And those leaves and stems or branches that fall become part of the soil. They decompose. Right, and so there's this whole life cycle in the trees. Eventually they die and they either decompose and become part of the soil, or sometimes they burn and that carbon biomass is just released directly into the atmosphere. So actually fires is a very direct way to increase CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. That carbon that's stored in the trees is released directly into the atmosphere very quickly. So we observe these processes by means of satellites, and NASA has a whole fleet of satellites to observe many different aspects of the Earth's environment related to the oceans, the atmosphere, and the continents, terrestrial ecosystems. And together they provide this big picture perspective of our Earth as a system. And so some satellites are measuring part of the hydrology cycle, carbon cycle, energy, different aspects. But you've got satellites that are measuring CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. You've got satellites measuring tree greening and tree health, evapotranspiration from vegetation, satellites that are measuring the amount of water in the soil so that trees can grow. So different components that affect this, the carbon cycle, both on ocean and on land. On ocean, you've got ocean color and you've got plankton, which is the equivalent of vegetation in the ocean, and they take up CO2 and produce oxygen too. So as you all know, the greenhouse effect, so the CO2, carbon dioxide, is a natural gas found on Earth. It's a greenhouse gas. The greenhouse effect is a natural effect on planet Earth. And thanks to this greenhouse effect, we can live comfortably in this planet. It's an average of 15 degrees Celsius. Otherwise, it probably would be too cold for us to live here. And so what's happening with the greenhouse effect, it's being perturbed. We're increasing the concentration of some of these greenhouse gases, including CO2, which is the most important man-made the most important greenhouse gas that humans are having an impact and a direct effect on. And so that's really what we're following here is CO2. We're really trying to understand what are the concentrations of CO2 and what are the roles of the different components of our Earth's environment in terms of taking up and releasing CO2. Okay, so one of the things that NASA does is it measures atmospheric CO2 concentrations from space. And I will show you a video animation of atmospheric CO2 concentrations starting in June 2003, and I think this goes through the end of 2006. And the bluer, the lighter colors, the blue, gray, are lower concentrations of atmospheric CO2, and then the yellows, reds are higher concentrations. So these are parts per million. And as you can see, as we go through time, these are average monthly atmospheric CO2 concentrations. As we go through the years, the months and the years, you'll see a gradual shift towards higher concentrations of atmospheric CO2. So it started out with the grays and the light blues, and it progresses to yellows and reds. So let me just put that into perspective. This is a graph. This is actually CO2 concentrations measured in Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. And throughout this time period, that's what it looks like. So there are two things to note here. One is that atmospheric CO2 concentrations have been increasing. But another thing that some of you might notice is that there's this cycle, right? And you might be wondering, what is this cycle? What is driving this cycle? And really what that is the vegetation up primarily in the northern high latitudes. This vegetation is seasonal. So in the winter, vegetation, there's really a noise change of the CO2 between the vegetation and the atmosphere. So it kind of hibernates. And so during this period of time when the vegetation freezes or hibernates, then during this period of time, atmospheric CO2 concentrations globally increase. And that's why you're seeing that it's that seasonal increase and decrease. So to put this all in perspective, in terms of atmospheric CO2 concentrations, currently we're at 415 parts per million. And if you look back at the historic record, really in the last hundreds of thousands of years, it hasn't gone up past 300 parts per million. So these are unprecedented times. And what can we do? What can vegetation do to help us? So let's understand the problem a little more. The northern high latitudes are considered ground zero for climate change. And the reason for this is because these areas have a strong seasonality, and the temperature increase in those areas has been twice to 3 times as fast as the rest of the planet. These areas, during the winter, there's a lot of snow. In the Arctic, there's floating ice. And so all of these areas that are white reflect the sun's energy back to space. So this seasonality where you have snow just reflects a lot of the earth, the sunlight back. However, these white patches, what's called the albedo effect, is being lost. So there's less snow cover. You've got darker areas. Exposed water is darker than obviously ice, and on land also you've got areas where you've got patches. You don't have this as much snow as you used to have. So those dark areas that are exposed tend to absorb more heat. And so overall, this area is warming faster than the rest of the planet. And so this has a big impact on the global carbon cycle, right? Because if this area warms, this is a tricky question now. The vegetation, as you saw, plays a large role. So what are the implications of a warming planet on the vegetation in the northern high latitudes? So the implications are that you might think theoretically it's a great thing, because as things warm, the growing season, that's the period of time when the vegetation grows. So that starts around spring and it goes through fall. So you've got sunlight, you've got liquid water, and You've got temperature, obviously that's above 0 degrees. And during this period of time, you've got vegetation growing, taking up CO2 from the atmosphere. And these are millions and millions of hectares. So you think that with increasing temperatures and longer growing season, which is what we're seeing, it's better that the vegetation will take up more CO2 from the atmosphere, but we're actually not seeing that, because in practice, what's happening is that the vegetation is becoming water stressed. There is overall, the snowpacks are thinner, and so there's less water availability. So at the end of the summer, the ground is becoming just very dry and vegetation is becoming water stressed, and it just stops taking up CO2. It just goes into shock, let's put it that way. And then also another phenomenon that we're seeing is that more and more there are these days, just continuous days of just really high temperatures up there, up in the Alaska area where I do a lot of my field work. And the vegetation there is kind of cold weather adapted. They're not really used to like these continuous days, just a week long of extreme temperatures, high temperatures. And so what happens is they become stressed and they shut down. So there are other things too. There are, because you have a longer growing season, you've got more opportunities for things like the bark beetle. You've got the bark beetle infestations and diseases attacking the vegetation. So you've got basically the bark beetle. Under normal conditions, it just had one reproductive cycle during the growing season, but now with a longer growing season and just better conditions for them to survive, they have two reproductive cycles, so they have more time to really have an impact on the vegetation. So the vegetation is weakened, and then you've got the next season, they're already weak and they get hit again by these infestations, and you have these massive die-offs. Okay, and that has overall an impact. Anytime you have trees that are dying, you're eliminating that possibility of that tree taking up CO2. And obviously when the tree decomposes, it's that carbon mass, part of that carbon mass is going up to the atmosphere. Part of it stays in the soil. If it burns, obviously most of it is going up into the atmosphere. This is a really cool video animation that shows, it shows the greening of it shows a seasonal cycle of vegetation and the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So the green that you see on land is kind of that seasonal cycle of vegetation. In some areas, you've got wet seasons, dry seasons. Take a look at Africa. You've got this greening that's going up in the northern edge of Africa. It's quite extraordinary. And so in the northern high latitudes, you've got during the spring and the summer, you've got the vegetation greening. And during this period of time is when you see this huge uptake of atmospheric CO2, which is represented in yellow in this animation. Okay. So that blooming effect in the northern high latitudes causes an uptake of carbon dioxide. So there you go. Obviously, there's a bit of a lag, and you expect that, but you can clearly see, okay, so here you've got an accumulation of CO2, you've got the greening in the northern high latitudes, and you've got that just enormous uptake of atmospheric CO2 afterwards. Pretty amazing, huh? All right, so I'll move on in the interest of time to the next slide. So another thing that we monitor from space are fires, and how is this changing, and what is the impact of fires in the global carbon cycle? You know, so fires are natural in many places, and other places they're deliberately done to clear land for either agriculture or for grazing. And And so we can see by means of satellites fires. And if we have a long enough database of fires, we can understand whether fires are increasing, what's the distribution, the extent of fires. And so you see a lot of fires in Africa. Africa is, it's kind of called the fire continent. There's just a bunch of fires going on there. A lot of them are, most of them are just, I believe they're natural fires. But it goes with the seasonality. So in the dry season, you'll have more fires, obviously, than in the wet season. And sometimes when you have drought years, 2015 was a very strong drought year, for example, in the Amazon, you see a larger amount of fires taking place. So what happens with fires, as mentioned, so that CO2 that's stored in trees is released into the atmosphere. You eliminate that ability of that tree to take up CO2. So it's got really strong implications in terms of the carbon cycle, and especially when it's at a large extent. And here is an animation that shows the transport of the carbon that's released during fires. And this is really an impressive animation. So the red, and by the way, this is model data. And so you see different flows of aerosols due to sea salt, due to dust. If you look at the Sahara, that's dust being picked up by wind currents, and then they're being transported to different parts of the world and out with the jet stream. And you can also see how fires generate these huge plumes of, they're primarily carbon monoxide. So carbon monoxide is an atom of carbon and an atom of oxygen. And once it's in the atmosphere, that molecule will not necessarily always, but it'll find another atom of oxygen and create CO2. So whenever you have forest fires, you have this huge release of carbon monoxide, and that's what primarily you're seeing with these red plumes. And as you saw, and another thing that we are monitoring from space is deforestation. And as you saw in the previous animation that was shown, it shows just the severity and how big of a environmental impact this has on the environment. I mean, these areas that are being deforested are huge, right? And they're being deforested for primarily grazing, at least in the Amazon. So this is an area that's about 60 kilometers by 60 kilometers. And during that period of time in this animation, it's been mostly deforested. Okay, so before I close, I just wanted to say that we have these different ways of monitoring vegetation in our planet, and different components of vegetation, whether it's healthy, whether it's being deforested, and what happens when vegetation is either cut down, or what happens when that vegetation is burned. What are the implications of that to the CO2 in the atmosphere? There are global accords to try to protect forests for their value. So rather than cutting them down for different reasons, protect them and have that hold a larger value than cutting them down. And a very important accord is called the REDD. So that stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. Very important word here is degradation. So it's not only about deforestation, but also there are many degraded forests. And those aren't really being taken into account. So there are millions of hectares of forest that are degraded because either they're sick or there's also selective logging. So when you pull out a tree, just because it's a specific type of tree, it might damage trees around them. So there's a lot of the forests that are standing, but they're degraded and they're not taking up CO2 the way that a healthy forest would. So these are being taken into account under this REDD activity. So with that, I close, but I just wanted to add something else. I've talked about forests being, or trees being the lungs of the planet, but as I was putting this presentation together, there's so much more than just the lungs of our planet. They're really the intestines of our planet. They transfer nutrients. They're the skin of our planet. They transpire. They modulate temperature. They are the heart of our planet. They're just these places where you have these huge amounts of flora and fauna and biodiversity. So they play a very large role in, I think, not only the health of our planet, but obviously our health too.